Hey there, this is Ross Izzard, and this is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing with more interesting people. So today, our guest is Ron Belak. I think I said that right. He might have to correct me later on. But in any case, even though I might not be able to say his last name exactly correctly, Ron is one of my heroes. He is the guy who literally wrote the book about fly fishing the backcountry in Colorado. It's called Fly Fishing Colorado's Backcountry. It is the best fly fishing book I've ever read. And I don't say that lightly because I've read a lot of fly fishing books. But Ron is the real deal. He's been all over the place. He's fished 600 lakes around Colorado, high-alpine lakes. He's been to all these small streams, backpacking, off-trail stuff, real serious backcountry wilderness fly fishing. And he's been doing it forever. He's been doing it for like 30 years, or maybe longer than that, probably longer than I've been alive, and is still doing it today. And he is an incredibly impressive individual. He has had a long and very successful career, as many things, but one of them being a backcountry fly angler. And he is, in my view, the go-to expert on all things backcountry fly fishing, ranging from how you decide where you're going, to how you research it, to how you get there, to how you catch the fish when you get there, and everything in between. So to say that I'm excited to have Ron join us on the podcast would be a major understatement. He is just a wealth of knowledge. I learned a ton from him. I still learn a ton from him by reading his books and reading his articles. And I think you're going to feel the same way. So he's going to talk to us today about sort of that early spring ice out on high alpine lakes and what it looks like to get out into the backcountry as we start slowly looking toward those warmer months in the beginning of spring. But also a whole bunch of other things that I think you might find interesting and useful and helpful to you as you're out there chasing fish in the sticks. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop in. Our guest today is Ron Belak, who is one of my personal heroes when it comes to backcountry fly fishing. The guy actually literally wrote the book about fly fishing the backcountry in Colorado, and I've read it cover to cover twice. I'm actually working on a third time, as well as a whole bunch of other great stuff about high alpine lakes and tips and tactics and everything else. So, when I was first getting into this crazy backcountry fly fishing thing, Ron's books and his articles were the thing that were my Bible, and I very often still have a copy of those books in my backpack when I'm out there. They're awesome, awesome materials. Ridiculously excited to have him on the podcast. So, Ron, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Ross.
I wonder if maybe you could start by giving us a rundown of your pretty storied fly fishing career. I mean, you've been doing this for a long time. You've been all over the place, including a whole bunch of super duper remote locations. And I'd love to just kind of hear your story and your journey in the fishing world.
Well, starting out fishing, my father took me fishing when I was 5-6 years old, and finally got a chance to go trout fishing probably when I was about 12 or so, and started fly fishing in high school. And that was back in the Mesozoic, by the way, compared to now. The first rod that I bought was actually a fiberglass rod, and graphite rods weren't even being made at that point. But then I moved out to Colorado after college, and after working a little bit, moved out to Colorado in 1979, and was just mesmerized by the backcountry and really started to fish the backcountry at that time. Mainly because I thought the drive up rivers were actually crowded. And this was back in 1979. We had about half of the population that we do now. But I loved getting out and into the backcountry.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because that's how I got started doing backcountry stuff too. Is it's like, the 50th time that you roll up to Deckers and have to have a fist fight with the guy for 10 meters of water. It's you decide that maybe there's a better way. You start hiking.
Well, I really did have a friend that ran into somebody that witnessed a fist fight on the Dream Stream, and this was probably 20 years ago. You don't run across that in the backcountry. There's enough elbow room.
Yeah, that's right. And some people love combat fishing. They love standing shoulder to shoulder and doing their thing, but that is not my thing. That's for sure. So I definitely hear that. And man, if it was bad in 1979, Here in 2024, yeah, it's a zoo out there if you go to the wrong places at the wrong times.
I started out as a geologist. My background is really in geology and finance, two kind of separate things. But the geology gave me training in science, and so I kind of approached things from that analytical aspect. I also had quite a few courses in college in biology, zoology, limnology, and stuff. So that got me asking a lot of questions about why do fish do this? What type of patterns work in different situations, and what's the scientific basis for doing that? So that kind of got me centered on that. The finance got me centered on actually understanding the publishing industry so that I could write a book and get it out to the public in a reasonable fashion.
So back during your professional career, and I guess I should be careful about how I say that because you've been writing professionally about fly fishing for a long time too. So maybe it's just your other professional career. But when you first started doing backcountry fly fishing, you were, you had a background in science and finance, and presumably were working in those fields. What got you kind of into doing the fishing thing? Was it something that you did on top of your work? Was it something that you did after you were done and you were starting to slow down on work, or how did it get started professionally for you?
Well, it really didn't have anything to do with my career per se. It started out obviously as a hobby, as with most people. I started writing about fly fishing back in about 1993. I was reading a lot of magazines at that time and wanted to know a little bit more about fishing the backcountry, and especially the high lakes. And there were a few magazine articles out there, but they were the typical me and Joe went fishing type articles, where somebody would talk about a story up in the Wind River Range, and we got the horses together and we went up to this lake and caught all these nice cutthroat. But there was nothing in there in the article about strategies for fishing or even where to fish. So I said, well, I can do a better magazine article than that. I could actually give you a little strategy and tell you where to go and fish, which is the first article that I did for Colorado Outdoors magazine. So that's kind of how I got started in the writing about fishing.
And you've been writing about it for a long time, right? I mean, what, 30 years, 40 years? How long have you been writing about fly fishing?
About 30 years or so. Started out with just a few articles, and then, you get up to 3 or 4 a year. And
Yeah, and I think I remember reading, it's in the Fly Fishing Colorado's Backcountry book. I think you said that what you did was you took like an amalgamation of all of the articles that you'd written over all that time, which had ranged from, like you said, I mean, insect activity and seasonal strategies and gear and safety and everything else, and then kind of stitched them together into a book. Is that right? Am I remembering that right?
yeah, that's pretty much what I did. Of course, there were some other articles written along the way on skiing and maybe birding, and they didn't make it obviously into the fly fishing books. But yeah, that's what I did. The first book was on strategies for fly fishing in the backcountry, both small streams and high lakes. And then I kind of divided that into chapters and stitched some of the articles like entomology all together in one chapter. And then the second book was an amalgamation of articles that I wrote for Colorado Outdoors on separate mountain ranges, and there were a number of those articles, and weaved those into a book. Covered basically all the mountain ranges that have a significant number of high lakes with trout in. And I think that project started in probably about 1999 or so, 2000, writing about one or two each year, and then eventually I said, well, I've got enough here to cover the state. So that was another book.
Yeah, we'll be talking about the book quite a bit as we go, I think. But I mean, this book is amazing. I don't know how it's probably more than 100 pages, and it covers everything you could need to know. And it is. I've read a lot of fly fishing books because I'm kind of nerdy and I like the science of it and I like to learn. But kind of like you were saying, back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there wasn't a lot of information That's still true today. I mean, a lot of people will write articles about fishing, but they're like 400-word articles that don't tell you anything about what you need to reach these places or how to catch the fish or what to expect. And that's part of the reason for the podcast, right? It's like we should have a place where we can go to get information about backcountry fly fishing. And your book is, at least as far as I know, one of the only really good resources on it out there. I haven't found many others, maybe a couple from Rich Osthoff or some others, but that's about it. So let me ask you this, Ron. I know you mentioned that you wanted to get away from people. I started there too. Like I said, I just, I needed to be alone when I was fishing. But you've got a real thing for high lakes and cutthroat in those high lakes. And a lot of these places and they're way out there, right? So I've taken a look at some of the places you've been. A lot of them are off in the middle of nowhere. You probably could not go that far and still get away from people. So I'm assuming that there is some other appeal for you in backcountry fly fishing and particularly high alpine fly fishing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the appeal is. What drives you out there to those places?
Well, I like the backpacking, and you do get away from the people to some extent. There are more people that are backpacking now, I think, than there were 20 years ago. And it reminds me really of the amount of people that were backpacking in the 1980s. We kind of had a little lull there in the 90s and the early 2000s or so. But I like the scenery up there. I mean, it's what Colorado is all about, the mountains, and that what was really drove me to go into the backcountry. I also like the lakes, and some of that is due to the geology courses that I took, geomorphology courses and glacial geomorphology. These are all carved by glaciers, alpine glaciers, and I remember studying that as an undergraduate in geology. I grew up in the Northeast in upstate New York, and we didn't have alpine glaciers there. We had a big continental ice sheet that was, almost a mile thick in some places. And out here in the West, because of the topography, you had these glaciers up in these individual basins up in the mountains. So that kind of attracted me as well. And then coming out here to Colorado, learning that those lakes had trout in it, that was just the ice cream on top of the cake for me. So I really enjoy that. The scenery is really something that drives me up there.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat. I say often, I want to catch a fish, right? Like I don't want to hike 15 miles into something and not touch a fish. It happens sometimes, but I'd prefer not to. But after I catch the one fish, I mean, I'm still going to fish, don't get me wrong, but I'll walk around and look at pictures and sit on the banks and just check it out because these places are right off of a movie set. They're incredible. I mean, some of them are just wildly beautiful. And I think people, you can go to the touristy destinations in Colorado and go see the stuff that you see in magazines, but man, the places that you can find in the backcountry are all of that and then about 1,000 times more. And it really is. It's about the place. So I definitely agree with that.
Most people are mesmerized by moving water, and I certainly am too. I like to get up to a river and look at it, and I say, man, if I was a trout, I would live right there. And some people will not fish still water at all. I love to fish still water, particularly at those lakes that are at or above timberline, mainly because during the summer, those waters are pretty cold. They rarely get above the comfort level of trout when you're up there at 11,400 feet to 12,000 feet or so. And the trout are going to be cruising shore. So you're actively looking for trout and you're casting to them. And it's an analogy with a hunter, really. You're looking for game. When you're fishing a river, you may see some rising trout, but a lot of times you're nymphing. And you're looking for structure there rather than actually seeing the fish. Unless, of course, you go out with Pat Dorsey, then he sees fish behind every single cobble and boulder in the river.
That's right, but he also makes you fish with like size 28 zebra midges, so I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
I like that. I actually am hoping to have him on the podcast later this season, but man, I've seen his midge box, and I think that he's got some, I don't know, I think he might have some mental health problems when it comes to the tiny midge patterns, but they work.
He even told me that it's getting a little bit more difficult for him to see those flies as we all get older.
I bet. Yeah, I hate those little midges. So, but I'll use them when I have to. So you mentioned, getting out to Stillwater. I agree with you. I mean, I love moving water, right? I mean, I fish streams a lot. That's where I learned how to fish. Stillwater came after that. Um, it's a lot of fun in different ways, like you said, but it's also really seasonal. I mean, your book kind of walks through the strategies and the tactics for each season of the year. And I think that stillwater fishing, and particularly high alpine stillwater fishing, is seasonal in a way that a lot of anglers who are kind of new to this backcountry thing don't understand. And I wonder if you could kind of help us understand that window, right? So when are these things open? When are they not open? And how does that sort of seasonal cycle work?
Yeah, and obviously all fly fishing has a seasonal cycle, whether you're on the rivers, but it, like you said, it's a lot shorter when you're up at altitude. So I start, thinking about going out kind of towards the end of May or so when some of the lower level lakes start to ice out, usually towards the end of May, early June. And we're talking about low elevation lakes being from about 9,000 feet up to about 10, maybe 10.2, 10.3 or so. And after ice out, these trout are really ravenous. After the lake ices out, after the ice breaks up, the winds push the ice out towards the outlet, and the lake will turn over or so in the course of a couple of days or so as the winds mix the waters and the sun beats down and starts to warm. And it'll differentially warm those waters that are closer to shore because they're shallower, and the trout will come in there looking for food. And so that's kind of the classic ice out type fishing. And I'll go out there in late May and early June looking for those types of lakes, particularly in the flat tops because there's a lot of lower elevation lakes there compared to the Front Range, let's say in the Denver Boulder area over to the west. And, there won't be much going on in the way of hatches. You'll be fishing streamers and wet flies on sinking lines. If the lake is close enough that you can actually take in a belly boat, that would be very advantageous. But as you know, a lot of these lakes are a little bit of a poke to get in there, and you're not going to drag in a belly boat, 7 miles to fish the lake. Although there are some portable belly boats now, and I have one that only weighs about 2.5 pounds. But so eventually you will move up in elevation, and lakes at higher elevations will start to ice out, and you just follow ice up in elevation upwards and get on those middle elevation lakes that are, between 10,300, 10,500 up to about timberline or so. And you can fish out, ice out like that at those elevations as well. And eventually you're going to get some hatches. You're going to start out with midges hatching, and you won't have to use your 28s right away. You can start out with some larger midges. Some of those will be as large as size 14 or so, black bodied with white wings. And eventually you'll get caddis start coming off when the water temperatures get into the upper 40s, 48, 49 or so, and calabatus when you get to maybe low 50s or so in elevation or in temperature. And then, usually about, I would say in January, you'll start to get those in July, you'll start to get those upper elevation lakes starting to ice out. And I'm talking about the ones that are above timberline. After about the 4th of July or so, they'll start to open up. Those aren't the greatest lakes to fish for ice out type techniques. You'll catch a few, but most of those lakes tend to have cutthroat in there. And you may have ice out for a couple of weeks, and then the cutthroats go into a spawn. And even though the cutthroat don't successfully spawn in those lakes, they need clear running water that runs over gravel to spawn. You can still catch them in the lakes, but they're interested in other things. But once those hatches start there at timberline, that's what I really like to fish, are the hatches up high. That's pretty much the front end of the season, and you'll get good dry fly fishing up at those upper elevations to maybe about mid-September or so, and then the waters start to cool down. Once the water temperature cools down, let's say below 45, the fish get a little bit torpid and the cutthroat's up high. And so you can start moving down in elevation and fishing for them at the lower elevations. And then as the lakes start to ice out or ice up, you fish the ice out type of tactics then in September into, maybe mid-October or so. Kind of like you would during the spring.
Yeah, right. And I want to highlight something that you said there about the spawn, which I think vexes a lot of people who haven't done a ton of spring high alpine fishing. There's a myth in the fly fishing community that which is that, sometimes the trout just aren't in those lakes and they're not going to eat anything. You don't see a fish. They won't take a fly. And very often it took me years to figure out that it was the spawning cycle that I was running into there. You'd see these big, beautiful fish hanging in the shallows, or maybe you don't see anything. And it was usually because I got my timing wrong on those lakes. But it's interesting to hear that that's primarily at those higher elevation lakes and maybe not so much at those, 8, 9, 10,000 foot lakes that open up a little bit earlier in the season.
Well, you do get it there as well. A lot of the lower elevation lakes have brook trout in there as well, and of course their spawn is farther out into the fall. So if there are brook trout there as well as cutthroat, you could at least fish for the brook trout. But the cutthroat, once they go into that spawn, they're not too much interested in other things. You can catch a few, by using glow bugs and orange wet flies and things, but they're not all that much interested. And that spawn can last for up to 3 weeks or so. And if you get up there a little bit late, and that's what happens with a lot of people that are going to the upper elevation lakes above timberline, because there's a lot of snowdrifts and stuff on the trails until you get up there in July. Well, those lakes have iced out, and those cutthroats are spawning, and they'll get up there and they'll see some nice fish cruising shore and stuff, but they're usually chasing each other around and hanging out on the gravel or the inlet or the outlet. If there is a substantial amount of stream that's running in or out of the lake, they'll stack up in there. And I leave them alone then. I let them try to do their spawn. There may be a little bit of spawn in there, but never enough to keep the population to high levels in the lake. So unfortunately, a lot of people get up there in that kind of low period for the cutthroats. So usually in Colorado, it's, about after the 15th or so of July is when you want to go to those upper elevation lakes. Second or third week of July starting. And August is the primo month.
September starts getting kind of cold. I mean, it's depending on how high up you are. I've caught snowstorms in September, so that's kind of a different game depending on where you go and when you go. It's a short window for sure.
Definitely.
So Ron, let me ask you this: it's wintertime, right? So these lakes have been frozen for a while now, most of them. I guess at this stage, all of them. And so we're back to what I call tailwater hell. We're kind of fishing the tailwaters and just trying to hang in there for the wintertime until we can get back out to doing the stuff that we love. And I still fish in the winter. I tie a lot in the winter. I mean, I stay involved in fishing as a sport throughout the year. But I spend a lot of time in the wintertime planning for the spring, right? Like looking forward to the summer months, looking forward to the warmer season, and thinking about where I go, and then specifically how I'm going to get there and how I'm going to do it safely when that ice off time starts to hit. And I wonder if you could talk about what goes into your planning process, because how many have you been to? Your book is about 800 high lakes, and I think you said you fished like 600 of those. So you've got a little bit of practice doing this.
Yeah, I fish about 600 in Colorado, and the reason that I say 600 is that second book that I wrote on Fishing Guide to 800 High Lakes in Colorado has an index in the back. And so I had to put in every lake in there, and I did a little spreadsheet and then alphabetized it, and I put a little X on one of the columns over there, whether I had fished it or not. And I added all this up at the end, and oh my God, there's 600 of these things that I fished, as well as some in, Wyoming and New Mexico and some other states and Alaska, Argentina, and as well. But I'm not as rigorous on the planning process as I used to be, because I fished 600 of them, so I kind of know where I want to go now. But if I was just starting out, and this is what I would do when I started to fish a new mountain range or so, first of all, I would decide where I wanted to fish. Somebody might only want to fish in the Front Range or Indian Peaks, or only want to fish in Rocky Mountain National Park, or only over on the West Slope, maybe in the collegiates. Well, if that's the case, I would go out and get the maps of that area and start with the U.S. Forest Service maps. That gives you an idea where the roads go, where there are any campgrounds in there, if you want to backpack into these areas, or if you want to do a bunch of day hikes out of a campground. That's a really good first place to start, and then start looking at the lakes and decide, I'm willing to go 7 miles one way on a backpack trip, but I'm not going to go any more than that. So you can kind of look at the trails and calculate, and then start looking at the lakes. However, other people say, I want to fish the best lakes, and I don't care where it is in the state. I want to look for, large cutthroat trout. I don't care about the brookies. I just want to catch the cuts. So in that situation, you really need to know where all the big cutthroats are. And that's why my book is good, because you can go and flip through those things, and it gives you kind of the sizes and the species on there. And then you can start looking at the lakes. Either one of those methods that you choose, you're going to have to get down to the USGS 7.5 minute topo maps. Those are usually the best maps in order to actually look at the terrain, calculate the elevation, and what you're going to expect out there. So that's kind of the two approaches that I kind of take to first winnowing out where you want to go. And there's a lot of other sources out there. There are hiking books, if you figure that you want to only do Summit County because you have a cabin or a condo in Summit County and or you live in Summit County. There are hiking books, Falcon books that will tell you about the trails going in there. They're a good supplement to like my books, because I don't have enough space in 190 pages to describe every little meadow that you're going to cross and the beautiful waterfalls and everything on the way, which these hiking books do. There are some books that go into a little bit more in detail about an area, like Steve Schweitzer's books. He's got one on Rocky Mountain National Park and another one on Indian Peaks that go into a lot of detail on individual lakes. Unfortunately, you don't have a book like that on every single area of the state. So those are good resources to start with. And once you kind of narrow it down to, a half a dozen or dozen lakes that you think you're going to get to, Google the lakes. You'll be surprised that every once in a while somebody will have a YouTube on a trip up there. And it may not be a fishing trip. It may be a Jeep road that they're driving up, and you go, oh, well, we better take the 4Runner up there because the Prius isn't going to make it, So it kind of gives you an idea of some. You won't find a lot of these YouTubes, but you will find a few of them, and you'll find some information from the Forest Service also on there as well, although their information on fishing is a little bit old at this time. But the trail information and the topography, All Trails has a lot of information on there. So that's kind of how I do my planning, and how I did it when I wrote certain areas of the book. There's a lot more to do, obviously, during the winter as well. Like you said, you tie a lot of flies.
You do tie a lot of flies, and I get really lazy toward the end of the warmer months about catching up on all the flies that I've lost in trees and fish and rocks and everything else. And so there's probably about 50 hours worth of sitting at a vise and just making up for what I probably should have done in the summertime. But eventually you just want to get back out there.
Yeah, I have to admit I don't do a lot of fishing during the winter. I might go out once or twice and fish a tailwater if I really get the Joneses to get out there. I have fished Argentina a couple of times in December, so that was really good. And of course, I fished a number of lakes there as well with big damselflies and dragonflies. So taking a trip like that to the southern hemisphere really helps with calming down the nerves about not getting out and fishing.
Yeah, I hear you on that one. I do fish the tailwaters, but I do it because I have to. It's an act of desperation. So it's okay. I mean, you can still have a good time. I was actually out yesterday and had a really good time, but it's it's not my first love, right? I'm out there because I need to be, and maybe not because it's where I want to be all the time. But fishing's fishing. It's not a bad day if you're fly fishing, that's for sure.
No, no, and if you don't catch anything, that's fine too. You never have a bad day out fishing. I've had a bad day on the golf course, before, and that's why I don't play golf anymore. So I can go out and fish and not catch anything and still have a grand old time.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about, Ron. I never don't catch anything. So that's, every time I'm out there, I'm bagging 50 of them. So, real quickly, just to back up to something that you said there, and I've got a couple questions about just access to these lakes, especially in those snowy spring months before all that snow comes off. But on the topographic maps that Ron mentioned, I just want to throw in a plug. If you do not know how to read topographic maps, you're going to have a bad time doing a lot of these lakes. Some of them are, they may have trails to them. As Ron said, you can find it on all trails. You can find some information from hikers. Some of them don't have trails to them, or they don't have very well established trails or trails that people use very often. And if you are not well accustomed to reading a topographic map, number one, you may not have a reasonable expectation of what that hike's going to look like, and you might overdo it or underdo it and wind up having a bad day. But number two, as we're going to talk about here in a second, slope angle and sort of general topography matters a lot in the spring because there's a lot of snow on the ground. And so you spend a lot of time, or at least I do, when I'm thinking about getting to some of these lakes. How do I avoid areas where I might have a serious issue with snow that I can't get through without snowshoes or avalanche risk or other things? You're going to be able to tell a lot of that by being able to look at a topo map and understand what those slopes look like and what the landscape looks like. And to that end, Ron, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, as you said, I mean, a lot of people wait till way later in the summer because it's tough to get through the snow and it's, it can be exhausting. But it can also be a lot of fun if you have the right stuff and if you're willing to do it safely. So when you're packing up and going to go hit one of these lakes at, I don't know, let's say it's at 9,500 or 10,000 feet, it's just starting to get into ice out. What does that look like? How are you getting up there in terms of access?
Well, long ago, I used to jump the gun on these things and go in on snowshoes. And most of the time I was successful on there because usually the lakes, the smaller lakes, ice out before all the trails clear. So I'd get up there on the snowshoes and sometimes we'd have a hard time just finding some bare ground to pitch the tent on, but the lakes were usually open. Now I kind of wait as I've gotten older here and wait until some of the trails clear, and I know which lakes will have clear trails getting into them. So, but you really do have to pay attention to the topo maps. If the lake is in a really tight cirque, it's going to take a little longer to ice out, particularly the lakes that are facing north and east. And a lot of the lakes on the east side of the Front Range obviously face that direction. So they take a little bit longer to ice out than lakes that may be facing south and west. Fortunately, a lot of the lakes at that 9,000 feet or so are on benches, so they're a little bit more open. So the more open the terrain is, usually the earlier they're going to ice out. And of course, the lower elevation lakes will ice out before the upper elevation lakes, given the same sort of topography and aspect as well. But you never quite know when a lake is going to ice out. There's a few tricks that you can use. I like to get on the Natural Resource Conservation Service's website and look at their SNOWTEL data. The SNOWTEL data tells you how many inches of snowpack you have at a specific site. And there's a number of stations all around in the mountains in Colorado. You can get on their map over there and pick a station that's closest to the lake you're going to go into, and check the elevation to see that it's kind of similar elevation. It'll tell you how many inches of snow are left on the ground. And I like to look at the snow water equivalent, which is the amount of water in that snow. And usually when that gets below about 10 inches of water, so you can expect those lakes to start icing out maybe in a week to 10 days or so, depending on what the weather is. I used to get really fanatic about this stuff and look at some of the lakes, look at the SNOWTEL data. Maximum snowpack in Colorado is usually about April 1 or so. So I really wouldn't start looking at it until, when you get into April or so. And I'd look at, initially we didn't, in the late 70s and early 80s, we didn't have these weather forecasts that you do now. And I was relegated to going in on a weekend because that's when I didn't have to work. And so I went in there. I didn't care whether it was going to snow or not. That was the only time that I had available. It was to go in. Now I can kind of look at the weather forecast out for 5 days or so and try to make a guess based on that. If you're traveling over I-70, you can look down at Black Lakes off of Vail Pass. That's in a tight kind of cirque, and look over there to see how those lakes are icing out. Guanilla Pass, you can drive up Guanilla Pass. There's Duck Lake, which is off to the side, which is a private lake. You can kind of look at that as well. I'm sure people on the West Slope have their little secrets of lakes that they look at. I used to drive the Mount Evans Road and go up there and look down at Lincoln Lake and look at Chicago Lakes. You won't be able to do that next year, though, because it's going to be closed in 2025. They're reconstructing that whole road that goes up to Mount Evans. So unfortunately, that's kind of taken out of the mix.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, though, you're, and this is, I guess, maybe part of the fun and part of the risk. I mean, eventually you're gonna pick wrong, right? So you can use these tricks that Ron's telling you about. You're gonna get up there and you're gonna find out that the lake is still frozen. It's gonna happen to you. It's happened to me before. You get a little bit overeager, you get up there and it's still frozen. And it can be frustrating, but it's okay because you make a note of it. And every year is different, right? I mean, the weather changes, snowpack changes. I mean, but you can get some data points from, okay, I went here in, early May and it was still 95% frozen and not fishable. Well, now you know that, and you can go back at the right time next year. So don't be discouraged by the fact that you may occasionally find a lake that surprises you and is still locked up tight when you get up there. At least you learned something.
And that's why it's important to keep a diary of your fishing, or at a minimum. I know a lot of people don't have wall calendars anymore. Everything is going to be on their phone, but I got stuff on my phone, but I've got a wall calendar, in the refrigerator in the kitchen, and we mark individual things on that calendar. We might put in a dental appointment on there, or an evening getting together with friends or so. But I also write the fishing information on there too. And so I'll say I caught a dozen fish or so, and the water temperature was this particular temperature. That will tell you a lot about when the lake iced out too. If you go up there and it's 45 degrees, you know that lake hasn't been open that long. If you go up there and it's already 59 or 60, it's been open a long time, and you've missed the ice out sequence for that lake. So we talked about the spawn and how you don't want to get caught there when the cutthroat are spawning. I mean, sometimes those spawns at 12,000 feet in a really snowy winter that you had before, that spawn can go on into August. And I've run across that in some of the early years that I went into as well. But when I was writing a lot of the articles for Colorado Outdoors on various mountain ranges, I would try to go in there during the spawn because I had to report on what fish were in the lake and how big they were. And so I could go up there during the cutthroat spawn. I knew there were only cutthroat in the lake, and I'd go up there and I'd walk over to the inlet or to the outlet, and I would see 20 fish in the outlet. And I could look at those fish. Yeah, they're all cutthroats, and they're all between 8 and 12 inches. I've got my data. I don't even have to catch a fish at that point, and I can write about what's in that lake. But then what I would do is I'd go over and I'd fish the lake because there are always some fish in there, and I'd fish small midges over there. There are always going to be some fish that are going to come up. I might only catch 3 or 4 fish, in the afternoon or so, and there's 20, 25 fish over there in the outlet, but I got the data that I needed. Now, everybody doesn't want to do that. Obviously, they would rather catch them.
Yeah, but the truth is that's part of it, right? I mean, I think, and that's the difference in my mind. Well, one of the differences between car fishing, right, where you're just hopping out and jumping in and it happens or it doesn't, then you go home, and backcountry work, because the time investment and the physical investment of reaching these places is so much higher that if you're just going to wing it, and go up there and like not remember which lakes you fished, not remember when you went exactly or what you caught or what you saw or what the conditions were, you're setting yourself up to spend a lot of time and a lot of leg power without a lot of results. So, if you want to catch the fish, being systematic the way Ron is talking about is, I think, one of the keys to doing that. Unless you want to spend a lot of time hiking the lakes where you're not having good luck, which chances are you're not going to do that for more than a season or two before you get frustrated and give up on it, which would be a real bummer. So, yeah, write it down. I mean, that's an easy thing to do.
There are a lot of other things that you want to do during the winter to get ready. We talked a lot about planning and where you want to go, but it's a great time to purchase new gear and to fix or mend old gear. That zipper on the tent that wasn't quite working right, to get that zipper replaced or the slider replaced, to clean the grit out of those zippers, repair any clothing that may have been torn, re-waterproof your supposedly waterproof gear. Gore-Tex has been around for quite a while. I think I bought my first Gore-Tex in 1979 or so, but those breathable waterproof fabrics are neither breathable or waterproof, really. They'll keep you dry, but only for so long. And you'll still sweat in those things because we're working really hard when we're climbing up to these areas. Usually the breathable garments are good for about 3 or 4 years before you have to recoat them or just buy another one. So we talked about tying flies during the winter time. Certainly go into the fly shops. I would not have recommended this 20 years ago to go in a fly shop and ask about where to go in the backcountry because nobody knew. They were all making their money off of selling a fishing trip to one of the tailwaters or one of the freestones. And you're not going to get a guide that's going to take you in, and into one of the high lakes. But a lot of the younger people now that are working in the fly shops actually know a little bit about the backcountry, and they can tell you where which lakes to go to or make some recommendations. At least here in the Front Range, I know people at the Blue Quill and the Golden Fly Shop, Charlie's Fly Box, Anglers All. There's a few people there. You might catch somebody that's working behind the register there that will say, yeah, I fished up in the James Peak. Yeah, you might want to try that and try this pattern. I caught some fish on it. And like I said, that's not something that I would have expected 15 or 20 years ago. So we got a new generation coming in behind that's willing to put out the effort to get to some of these places.
Which probably means that eventually I'm going to wind up having to hike even further, right? Because I'm going to start bumping into guys even in these super remote locations. So it's cool, but it might not be good news.
If you're a photographer, and a lot of us do like taking pictures up there with something other than your phone, if you have a more expensive camera, make sure you clean the sensor during the wintertime, and get that dirt off. Take it down to the camera shop and have them clean it. If you do belly boat, make sure that you don't have a leak. I made this mistake just a few years ago that I didn't get a chance to take the boat out and test, and I got to my first lake and I had a slow leak on there on the boat, and I'd have to get out about every hour and a half or 2 hours and pump the thing back up. So it's often good, come April or so when we get some of the lower reservoirs that ice out. If you're going to do any belly boat fishing, get in your waders and get out in that boat and paddle around. Make sure that you don't have a leak in your waders or there's one of the bladders on your belly boat has a slow leak, especially along the seams on those things. That's where they tend to leak, either in the waders or on the belly boat along the seams.
Yeah, and if we're being honest, if you're really out there doing this stuff, you're going to get wear and tear on your gear, right? So some of it is your waders, some of it is your reels, it might be your fly line that you kind of nod through, it's your boots. There's a lot of stuff that probably isn't in great shape by the time you finish hiking your butt off all summer. And what Ron's saying about taking care of that and doing your maintenance in the slower months is a really good point, because if you don't do that, and I know that the tendency is to just kind of throw your stuff in the garage and be like, I'll see you in April or I'll see you in May. The problem is that then you're going to put it on, you're going to realize that it's broken or it hasn't been maintained correctly. And then you're going to miss fishing time because you got to go, maybe you have to replace it or you have to warranty it or you have to have it fixed or whatever it happens to be. And then you don't have it to use and you're not fishing. That sucks. So yeah, do that in the quiet months when you've got some time and the stakes are a little bit lower. It'll buy you more time on the water later. So Ron, let me ask you about the gear that you carry when you're hiking up to these early ice out lakes. This is probably a big list, so I'm not expecting you to be comprehensive. We've talked quite a bit about gear for this stuff, but you mentioned earlier, there's going to be snow on the ground. That open ground is going to be tough to find. The weather is pretty volatile still in those early spring months. And so what's kind of your must-have stuff in your backpack when you're going up for a spring session at one of these lakes?
Well, other than you're going to take a little bit more in the way of clothing. A summer trip, you might get by with, perhaps a pair of zip-off pants or, and then maybe you throw in an extra pair of shorts or so. But when you go up there in the spring, you're going to have thermal underwear as well. You always take up a full rain suit, pants as well as a jacket. So you'll probably have an extra lightweight down jacket as well when you go up in the spring. You'll have gloves, you'll have a wool cap as well. It depends on the lake. You may take waders on some of these lakes, and that's going to add a lot of weight onto that particular trip. But you don't need to take in a pair of wading boots. You can take in an old pair of running or tennis shoes, and those things weigh a lot less than wading boots. tie those onto your pack. They'll save you, a pound and a half right there by taking those shoes in. I no longer go in on snowshoes. I do enough snowshoeing during the winter time, so I know enough of lakes that I can go in where I don't have to take the snowshoes in anymore. But you want to make sure that you have a good pair of hiking boots. I see people running around in what's not more than a running shoe, a trail running shoe, and you really need a lighter weight pair of hiking boots, whether they be all leather. Although Loa makes a really lightweight leather boot right now. Make sure that they're snow sealed. I use gaiters, but I will use the old neoprene gaiters. You remember when we had the neoprene waders and stuff, and they came with neoprene waders? Well, those go on over your boot and your sock and all the way up to your pants. Or if you're going in a pair of shorts, which I do sometimes, they go in up above your sock, and they'll keep the snow from going in if you have to step over drifts. Or even hike on snow. They'll keep the snow out of your boot. Make sure you have at least one extra pair of socks to go along. And as far as fishing equipment is concerned, I always take a collapsible net along with me. Usually on these ice out trips, you catch some of the bigger fish that you will during the year. At ice out. Now, I like to take up a 6-weight rod, although your 9-foot 5-weight is going to work fine. But if I know I'm going to lake where there's some 15-inch brookies in there or some larger cutthroat, I'll take up the 6-weight on that. And obviously a sinking line, and I mean a full sink line, not a sink tip. A full sinking line, something that sinks about 5 or 6 inches per second. That's a type 5 or a type 6. You'll cast it out there and let it sink, and then strip those streamers and wet flies in. And you can take up a floating line as well, and some midge patterns, but you'll mainly be fishing those streamers and wet flies at ice out. And make sure that your tent is in good shape there, that your zippers aren't going to blow out, because you don't want to get caught in, a squall of some sort with, your fly being wide open because the zippers don't work.
Yeah, safety is a big factor, I think, in those early months, and the later months, but you need to make sure your gear is dialed in, because, if you catch a squall at night and your stuff's not dialed in, at the best, you're going to have a really bad night, and at the worst, you could find yourself in pretty significant trouble there pretty quickly. So do take that seriously. And if you don't know what you're doing on that front, it's okay. It's okay to say that you don't. There are books out there you can read. There are people you can go and talk to, but understand how your gear works, know what you need, and be up there prepared, because the weather is pretty wild at those elevations in the early spring, and it can catch you off guard pretty quickly for sure.
And you do want to keep your weight down. And when I started this, in the late 70s, gear was really heavy. I had a 10-pound tent, for 2 people. It had aluminum poles, that were about 3/8 of an inch in diameter. That thing was really heavy. And, you had ponchos and all kinds of stuff. I'd have a 50-pound pack going in for one of these spring ice out ordeals. And now the tents are 2.5 pounds, another 4 ounces for, the footprint of the tent. The sleeping bags are, about 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds or so. The gear has gotten a lot lighter. And there is a chapter in my book on Fly Fishing Colorado's Backcountry on getting your weight down and how you can cut your weight down. And you could be able to get this down to about 35 pounds for one of these spring ice out trips, and even down to 30 pounds or so for hiking around in the summer. But all this gear is a little bit more expensive, and probably the place where you're going to get the biggest bang for the buck is on the backpack itself. My first backpack weighed 7.5 pounds or so. You can get that down to about 3.5 or 4 pounds right now. You're not going to have the really cushy straps on it on the shoulders and along the hips, but you're going to get adequate padding on there. You save 3 pounds there. You save another 2 pounds on the tent. You save a pound maybe on the sleeping bag. You don't have to cut off the handles on the toothbrush or anything, or count out the inches of other things like dental floss and stuff. You don't have to get ridiculous about this stuff, but those things that I mentioned, freeze dried food, obviously, that all brings things down weight wise. And as you get older, you realize that I'm not going to take a 50-pound pack, unless I'm going in for 7 days or something like that.
Yeah, and every new backpacker goes through the phase where you think you're Superman, right? And you're like, I can carry a 50-pound pack or a 60-pound pack and no issue. Yeah, you only have to do that a couple times, especially once you start getting out of your 20s. Before you start realizing that saving weight matters, for sure. It's it's a much more enjoyable experience with lighter stuff, that's for sure. So count the ounces. So Ron, if somebody wanted to read your book, and I almost hesitate to ask this because I almost don't want to give people the secret book about your 800 high lakes, but it's awesome and they should have it as well as your other books. If they wanted to find these books, order them, read them, have copies for themselves, where would they go to learn more? Yeah, if you can get a hold of these books, you really should, guys. So the two that we're talking about today are Fly Fishing Colorado's Backcountry and The Fishing Guide to 800 High Lakes in Colorado. The Backcountry book in particular, I think, is going to be relevant to just about anybody in a Western state and maybe some folks in the Eastern states, depending on where they live. Obviously focused on Colorado, but there is a ton of ridiculously good information in there about the science of all this, how lakes work, how fish work, how bugs work, hiking gear. I mean, it's awesome. I mean, it is, I think, the Bible for backcountry fly fishing and not just in Colorado. So if you can get a copy, you should. And then the 800 High Lakes book is a great place to find new lakes. I hope none of you buy that one because then I might see you at some of these places. But Ron has put together an incredible list of some really, really, really beautiful, special places, and I really enjoy working my way through them because they're incredible. So, Ron, thanks for all your work. Thanks for putting this together so the guys like me can grab it and learn from you. And thanks for making time to talk to us today. This has been a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you for the invite, Ross. Thank you very much.
All right, that'll do it for today. Loved having Ron on the show. Like I said earlier, he is really genuinely kind of an idol to me. Being able to have him on to share a little bit of his knowledge and a little bit of his perspective on this whole crazy backcountry fly fishing thing was really cool and really special for me. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Hope you're having an awesome week. It's still pretty cold out there, but I bet if you're motivated, you could get out and get some fishing in. So I hope you do that. When you do, be safe, make sure you're prepared, and we'll see you real soon. Until next time, this is Ross, and maybe I'll see you out there. Or maybe you'll just see Ron.